Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breaking Point, Tackling Systemic Racism in Miami. I'm KRISTIN Roberts, Vice President of News for McClatchy. Perhaps you're watching us via the homepage of the Miami Herald, or you're joining us after seeing a retweet from a colleague or an email from our opinion editor. However you found us today, thank you for joining. George Floyd's death has ignited weeks of protests across America, and indeed around the world. Our journalists have stood witness to these events, recording the voices of this protest movement, capturing breathtaking photos and live videos, and at times subjecting themselves to the tear gas and rubber bullets that have met even peaceful protesters. Ida B. Wells once said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And my promise to you is that we will continue to document the events taking place throughout our country. Today, as part of that mission, we turn our attention towards solutions. We've gathered leaders, activists, and elected officials to help explore specific issues related to race, law enforcement, and systemic racism in our communities, as well as the policy changes needed to address racial disparities and racial bias. While the crisis is national, change will happen at the local level. And I hope these discussions bring you insight, add value to your conversations, and encourage change in our communities. So let's begin. I'd like to introduce Miami Herald opinion editor, Nancy Ankrum, who will lead today's conversation.
Thank you, KRISTIN. I'm the editorial page editor for the Miami Herald. KRISTIN's right. The death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers spurred protests, but it spurred more than that. The injustice has spurred accusations of racism, difficult conversations, and corrective actions from corporate boardrooms to the offices of university presidents to the man and woman on the street. The Miami Herald's Breaking Point will take a look today at implicit bias, what it means, and how we all allow it to affect how we see and don't see each other. We've brought together the Herald's Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Leonard Pitts Jr. and Miami music producer and community leader Luther Campbell to begin the conversation. I welcome them both. To kick off the conversation between the two of you before I bow out, I want to ask Leonard. You have said that we all have implicit biases. However, when it comes to race, it has different implications for Blacks and whites. Can you please elaborate?
I'm back. Can anyone hear me? I can't hear anyone.
Leonard?
Nope.
No. How are you doing, Luther? Why don't we kick it off with you? Talk about where maybe implicit biases have affected you, a former rapper or music producer, an African-American man in Miami. Can you talk just briefly about implicit bias and the role it's played in how people see you?
Well, I mean, thank you again for having me. I think this is a great forum to talk about implicit bias because, I guess to answer the question, how have it affected me in my life? When you take me, most people would look at me as a record artist or a record producer, Luther Campbell of the Two Live Crew, and they would automatically associate me with the music that they see, which was what we promoted, but then they wouldn't really associate with me with the business that I run, the guy who discovered Pitbull, the guy who, saved all these different artists and produced different types of music from different genres of the music. So the bias becomes what is written in the newspaper. So if it's written in the newspaper that he's such a bad guy, he's this misogynistic pig, then at the end of the day, the rest of the world feels that way. And so when it comes to me as a young man growing up in Liberty City, Miami, Florida, bus to Miami Beach, the bias is the fact that, oh, these kids come from Liberty Square housing projects. Everybody from Liberty City, which not necessarily was the case, because me and my other 4 brothers, we lived in a house, and we did not necessarily lived in the affordable house situation. So the bias becomes, because of where you live at, because you're from Liberty City, you automatically get profiled. And I think implicit bias is a cute word of giving people an out as to saying that they're really racially profiling individuals, but it sounds politically correct to use the word implicit bias.
So you're saying it's a euphemism for basically racism?
Yes, I'm definitely saying that, because I mean, when you look at, whatever, any scholar that broke down implicit bias, when they broke it out, I mean, it's like, given a pass. If the doctor, if I say, if one young man says, use a test of government, a person automatically think government as being corrupt. If a person says corporate, then the next person automatically thinks, if you're in the corporate world, then you're greedy. So it's no different than I'm black. Number one, okay, so I grew up in a governmental housing project. That's a bias. But now I live in the suburbs. Then now I work for a corporation. Excuse me?
You're practically a soccer dad.
Exactly. I became a soccer dad. So it's no difference than my situation. So the bias sets in. The bias sets in with individuals who just don't want to use their common sense. And that's why I say it's basically a cop out as to, not using your common sense, but you're basically racially profiling an individual based on the color of their skin. No different than an African American racially profiling a guy with tattoos and a rebel tight shirt, and he automatically thinks he's a guy that don't like black people, but he's probably the guy that loves black people.
Luther, I'm going to bring in Leonard Pitts. He is back with us. Leonard, before I leave the two of you, I asked if you could talk about you talked about in the past how implicit bias means different things for blacks and for whites. Can you talk about those implications?
Yeah, I just got in on the tail end of Luke's remarks just a moment ago. And the thing that jumped out at me, if I can play a little devil's advocate about the point that he made about the guy, judging the guy, having bias against the guy with the Confederate flag tattoos or T-shirts, there's a difference. The guy who has those things chose those things, and he chose them knowing, presumably knowing what they represent in the real world. I didn't choose, my skin tone, for that matter, my height, or the texture of my hair. And the fact of the matter is that we, all of us, black, white, or otherwise, draw conclusions about who a person is based on things that the person, in fact, did not choose. We draw conclusions based on skin color. We draw conclusions based on hair texture. We draw conclusions based on accent. We draw conclusions based on a lot of stuff. And the thing of implicit bias is that it's not just the bias that other people hold against you. If we're going to be totally honest with ourselves, it's also about the bias that sometimes we hold against ourselves or those who look like us. Hello.
I thought it was another question. So
I was waiting. I guess it's just us now.
It's just us. Oh, great. I mean, again, the thing that I have with implicit bias is, when the word, to me, it automatically it goes in conjunction with police officers. It's okay. Police officers need implicit bias training, sensitivity training, and like I said earlier, I think it's just a cute way of dressing up dressing up racial profiling, and where racial profiling comes from, and saying, oh, the person, she's really not racist. She's really not a bad principal. But at the end of the day, when you go to her school is failing. But she thinks that she's a good principal, no different than a police officer who thinks he's a great police officer. He's not racist at all. But at the same time, he's stopping and frisking every African-American young man because he really thinks in his mind that he's really doing the job. And so that's where the bias comes in. But my thing is, where does the bias, where's the birthplace of the bias? Is it the media?
Oh no, the bias existed before there was media. You got to understand that, the whole concept of race came about 300, 400 years ago, give or take, and that the whole idea was to give an excuse or rationale for slavery. There's a historian that I like, Noel Ignatieff, I believe is the one who wrote this, said that Africans did not become enslaved because they were black. They became black because they were enslaved. In other words, we're going to enslave these people. We need a justification. The justification will be they have this dark skin and somehow that makes them inferior to us. And that's where the bias comes in. That's where the bias begins, because if you're going to think of yourself, if I'm going to think of myself as a good person, and a Christian person, but I'm going to do terrible, awful things to you that I'd never do to you if I considered you a human being, then the only way that I can reconcile that emotionally, intellectually in myself, morally in myself, is to make you not a good human being, or indeed make you not a human being at all. And so the whole house of cards rests upon, we don't look too closely into that. If you're white American, it's very hard to look too closely into that, because you will not like what you see. And what that tells you, not just about yourself and your family, but about the history and the country that produced you. So, it's very difficult to really want to deal with that straight on, because it requires looking at some really unpleasant truths for a lot of folks.
So, so is it that, how do you fix it? Because if it's been in us for 300 years, right. And after we had the conversation, I went and looked up A Girl Like Me. I looked at the video, and going back to what you just said, here are 3-year-old kids, picking and choosing what's bad and what's good. And here are 3 and 6-year-old kids saying, oh, the black baby doll is bad, and the white baby doll is good. And these are black kids, and we grow into that. How do we grow out of it if it's all around us? Do we ever expect the police officers to really don't have bias against African Americans?
As long as the police officers reflect this society. That's one of the things that I always say, that we focus so much on the police, what they do, and I understand that, because when the police misbehave, it's dramatic. Somebody gets killed or somebody gets jailed. But you have the same thing in journalism. You have the same thing in health. You have the same thing in the entertainment business. You have this kind of bias everywhere. And it's interesting. You talk about the A Girl Like Me, which was the implicit bias test. This young lady recreated the dolls test from the 1930s and 40s, where black kids preferred the white dolls over the black ones. I took an implicit bias test online about a month ago, and I was not surprised to find the result was that I have a slight bias toward white men. Now, I don't have any conscious, you will not find me consciously saying a white man is, whatever. But the test says I have a slight bias, not a major bias, but a slight bias toward white men. And how can we be surprised? I grew up with John Wayne and Little Joe Cartwright and Andy Griffith, and when I grew up, and for that matter, still now, white men were the voices of authority, reason, intelligence, morality, everything, you name it. So it's very hard, to the degree that you're not white and to the degree that you're not a man, to find your own self and your own worth in that. And we're still doing that to kids to a degree, probably to a lesser degree than it was for me as a child of the 60s and 70s, but we still do that in our media, in our churches, in our entertainment media, our news media, our churches, our synagogues, wherever. you know, the ultimate authority and the ultimate morality and whatever still is white male. And that's what we need to deconstruct. And one of the things that makes it hard is, you know, for a lot of white brothers, you know, it's like, what's the problem? You know?
Yeah. Exactly. But you know, for me, it seems like I mean, where I grew up was Liberty City, Miami, and everything bad when it came to white. It was every white person. You know, we grew up under the impression that white people are just bad people. We had the police officers. It was all white, and then it became Hispanic. Black men getting shot on motorcycles. Black men getting called every different type of name. We're getting corralled, rounded up on the streets. Living 10 blocks away from the government housing projects that we were taught. The reason they call it the pork and bean is because when white people lived in Liberty City, you know, they came up with the name pork and beans because only African Americans can afford pork and beans. So everything around us gave us the notion that the white man was bad, the white man was evil. And so, but we had to, at the same time, our parents taught us that, you know, you judge people based on who they are. And so I think for us as African-American race, we're easy to forgive the white man and the white woman, but it's not so easy for the white woman and the white man to forgive, to have an open mind about us as individuals. And I find that very difficult because we can learn that every white person ain't bad, but then at the same time, we still have that bias to think that, you know, when I walk into the water towers of Chicago and go into the elevator into the mall and the white lady clutches her purse, then that does something again to me because I'm trying to be a good American.
Again, we're all taught biases. You know, I thought, you know, years ago, I thought, well, you know, I'm beyond that. I'm above that. I don't have these biases. And what you learn as you become more aware of yourself and how these things work is that nobody can say that. When I first got to the Miami Herald, you know, I had two editors, both, I had a bunch of editors, but two editors in particular, both white women, which was fine, both white women from the South with pronounced Southern accents. And here I'm thinking, I'm cool. I'm cool with everybody. The first time I heard these women speak, it scared the hell out of me. You know, Leonard, I got to give you a deadline. Oh, Lord have mercy. You know? And I had to catch myself because these same two women, they're two of my favorite people. You know, we've grown to become, we're very good friends. They're two of my favorite people on earth, two of my favorite editors, two of my favorite people. But when I first met them, you know, all my illusions about how enlightened or how beyond it I was, you know, I had to recalibrate. Oh no, when I first time I heard North Carolina come out of this white lady's mouth, which is the first time I think I'd ever heard Southern accent not on television, scared the hell out of me. Now here's the thing though. My biases, your biases do not have the power. My biases may ruin somebody's day, may ruin a white person's day. I may say something or do something that ruins that person's day. White people's biases are law and custom. So their biases are going to ruin your life or take your life. And that's the whole ball game right there. And once we begin to understand that, and once white people in particular begin to understand and be able to cop to their biases without feeling like, oh Lord, I'm a terrible person all the time, then we can move forward. But until we do that, we can't. I don't feel like I was a bad person for you know, getting fearful first time I heard North Carolina come out of that woman's mouth. That's what I was trained to. You hear North Carolina come out of a white woman's mouth, you go the other way, you know. But I learned.
Yeah. Leonard, we're going to have to make that the last word.
Oh, man.
I know we could all listen to this forever. It's the last word. It was a funny word, but it's also a sad word, isn't it? Yeah. I am so grateful for the two of you for being in conversation, for really going deep and giving us just so much to think about from your personal perspectives. I would like to thank the Miami Herald's Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Leonard Pitts for being with us, and especially Luther Campbell for taking the time to be with us and to be in conversation. Bravo to you both. Thank you, thank you. Next, I want to welcome JARET Davis, a Miami superstar attorney for Greenberg Traurig, PA.
Hi, Nancy.
He has spoken eloquently about the subtle but still obvious effects his mere presence brings the minute he walks into a boardroom. And Elsong Richardson. She is the Dean of the University of California, Irvine School of Law, and a nationally recognized expert in implicit bias. Thank you both for joining us. JARET, you bring a stellar resume and a career of accomplishments to the table. As a 6'8" Black man, you also bring out preconceived notions, fears, and expectations that simply do not do you justice. What have you experienced, maybe, that your white and Hispanic colleagues have not?
Yeah, and thank you, Nancy, for having me on, and thrilled to serve with Dean Richardson. I'm glad you gave that preface so people understand. I'm sitting down right now, so people may not know my physical dimensions, but 6'8", I think it's safe to say fairly large in dimensions. And what I found is people generally, we're all sort of a lazy species. We tend to go for pattern recognition. And so people have in their head preconceived notions of what various anyone should look like, whether it be what does a lawyer look like, what does a football player look like. I probably get on the street more, people assuming I play ball, not even asking. I've had probably once a week, people just assume, oh, who'd you play for? Assuming that I play for ball than a corporate lawyer, which is what I do. And I can tell you just in the general interaction, it has some interesting consequences. I'll give you one story that's not even in a boardroom so much. It was more of almost in a courtroom, even though I'm a transactional lawyer. One time we were handling a mediation for a client, and I was there just to do consultation because it was a complex valuation exercise of a company. And the mediator was a former judge, very old. I believe he was around the 80s or so. And halfway through the mediation, he turns to myself and he turns to my partner, who was the litigator handling it. And, she was a very tall woman, very beautiful. And there's a reason I say that. And he looks to our client and looks to opposing counsel and says, wow, this is something else. We've got the captain of the football team and the head cheerleader. And, exactly, you gasp. A lot of people would say, well, isn't that harmless? The problem is, if any of you deal with law, whether it be in a criminal context, a civil context, a negotiation, et cetera, you know that preconceived notions drive whether or not you're successful in your outcome. So he is just now established, and there's obviously nothing wrong with playing ball, and there's certainly nothing wrong with being a cheerleader, but he's established that we are not, lawyers with 20 years plus of experience. She's amazing. She actually chairs, one of our litigation practice groups. I mean, I'm the managing partner of the largest law firm here. None of that mattered. What mattered is, in their eyes, I was the captain of the football team and she was the head cheerleader. And you can imagine, fortunately, our client adored us already. We had a lot of experience with this client, so it didn't faze him. My colleague, she's kicking me under the table saying, let it go, just let it go, because I'm about to lose my mind on it. But it shows you how these preconceived notions get established. And, obviously I've got other examples out there, but I don't want to hog up my time. But it's something you end up keeping in the back of your mind. And I always tell people, and I'd be curious to get Dean Richardson's take on this, because this is a tough conversation. And it's very easy to make it confrontational, where you go up to people. And I deal with this at work. We do a lot of implicit bias training. And I find it helpful to try and personalize it to myself to say, look, we are not coming down on anyone individually. It doesn't help me if you start getting defensive. And one of the things I always say about implicit bias versus the more conscious forms of racism, and I do agree with the prior panel that it all comes from the same core ultimately. So many years, decades, and centuries have gone by. Unfortunately, we can't even unpack where it comes from. But what I always tell our people is, no one is saying you're evil. What we're saying is you're sick. And as importantly, I'm saying I'm sick. It is impossible to grow up in our society right now without being sick. And I always analogize it to alcoholism. The prior panel just said, well, how do we fix it? I would take issue with that and say, you'll never fix it. If you talk to any program on alcoholism, the first thing they'll say is one of the first most important steps is accepting you'll never be well. You just live with it day by day. I guarantee you probably on a daily basis, I am probably struggling with some implicit bias, whether it be about gender, sexuality, etc. I need to accept that. And so when I make my decisions, because I also agree with Leonard Pitts that in a vacuum, the average human being's biases may not be that consequential. But when you marry those biases with power, in my case, I'm managing partner of a major law firm, that's where it becomes consequential. Sure. And so I think we all have a responsibility to accept that, like I said, like alcoholism, we will never be truly cured. And it's something we all will struggle with every single day. But I also find it helpful, like I said, to accept that I see it as an illness more as an evil. Conscious racism and more so just like with alcoholism, the inability to accept it and do something about it leads to evil. I'd say implicit bias, the inability to accept it and do something about it will lead to evil, but at least on the first blush, it's more of a sickness than I would say an evil.
Sure. I want to definitely bring in Dean Richardson here. How do you explain what JARET has experienced, what so many African Americans and others experience? What are the roots?
So again, thank you so much for having me here. And it was great to hear JARET Davis's experiences and insightful commentary on implicit bias and the prior panel, because I think much of it has already been said. We live in a country that was built on racism. The wealth of our country was built on the backs of Black slaves. We have learned, and the reason I say all of that is we have all learned as a country that to be Black is to be inferior. And I'm not saying that that's accurate. What I'm answering is your question: where do these unconscious and conscious biases come from? They are systemic, they are structural, they come from our nation's history. I mean, if you think about the fact that we, and when I say we, I'm talking about Black people like me, we have been slaves longer than we have been free. Mm-hmm. And when you take that into account and everything that means, right? Everything that means in terms of our ability to be employed, to be at the head of corporations and businesses, to be one of the managing partners at Greenberg Traurig, that takes a lot in a country that was built on conscious and systemic and institutional racism. So the way that our country looks, where people are situated in terms of our power, that reality that we see every day when we walk down the street, that we see when we engage with policing practices, that we see when we open up our browsers to read the news, when we look at the crime rates, when we look at the poverty rates, when we look at education statistics, all of those things come from the history of racism that we have. And these current realities, however, impact our minds. It is that pattern recognition that JARET mentioned earlier. Our brains, our minds are efficient. They're like computer systems, right? They learn from all the information that comes in. And so what our brains have learned, what my brain has learned when I took the implicit association test, is that I do have a slight preference for people who are white. I have a slight preference for people who are lighter skinned. I believe that men, unconsciously, are leaders and women are not. And everything that I just said to you conflict with my conscious beliefs. I mean, I was a civil rights lawyer. That's what I spent my career doing. So it's remarkable that I have these unconscious biases, but they stem from our problematic and racist history and all the implications of that to the way our society functions today.
Dean Richardson, where do people access this test? Leonard Pitts said he took it also. Is this something readily accessible that you would encourage all of us to do that deeper dive into who we are?
I definitely would. I mean, the reason I started writing and thinking about unconscious bias or implicit bias is because I took that test. And it's so easy to find. You just go into Google and you type in implicit association test, the implicit association test, or the IAT for short. And you can find the test and log in and then take all sorts of tests. It's not simply about race. There are also ones about gender, about insects, religion, guns, all sorts of things that you can learn about your unconscious mind.
That's a wonderful takeaway. Thank you very much. JARET, you know, you said that your colleague was kicking you under the table. I remember one time my husband and I went to an event. I was in front, so I asked for a ticket, 2 tickets. And the woman, she was an older white woman, at least at the time, I'm probably her age, looks at my husband, who's white, and says, "Oh, she's so polite," referring to me. At that point, my husband heard my mouth go,
You speak so well.
as I was getting ready to say, I don't know what, but it wasn't going to be great. And he grabbed my hand and pulled me away.
At least they knew that you two were together.
Yeah, right. Often, right. That's not the case. How do you navigate, JARET, saying something and not saying something? And has that evolved as you have gained more professional professional influence over the years?
Yeah, that's always the tricky question, because you want to be effective. I think there's always a balance. I feel like whenever you deal with this situation and you're deciding internally how to respond, there's really 2 factors come into play, right? One is the catharsis. You're upset right now, justifiably, and you want to validate that emotion and you want to sort of vent. The other aspect is you want to educate the person who's just made that mistake. And I would contend these are in opposite, because the catharsis part is the emotional part, which is going to force people to be in defensive. Exactly. And then the other part is the more analytical part. I guess part of it's a creature of my personality. Part of it's just, upbringing, etc. I tend to more want to go with the effective part. I want to educate people. And I think, and I'm glad you mentioned the progression of my own career, because how I would approach it does change with each stage of your career and where you are. And this also goes to law enforcement. I mean, obviously you've got someone with incredible power. They've got a cannon on their waist. You need to be very careful how you address it, no matter how justified you are. Depends on the circumstance. My personality is one that tends towards humor. So if someone had said the proverbial, "Wow, you speak so well," I have a few comebacks that I'll do with that, which will usually educate them pretty well as to, "Are you kidding me? I've got 4 years of undergrad, 3 years of law school, and 22 years of doing complex multi-billion transactions." Yeah, I don't say it that way, but that's basically the gist of what I'm trying to convey to them. I find humor, there's a reason why some of our greatest ambassadors, in my opinion, have been comedians, Black comedians, everyone from Richard Pryor to Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, now Dave Chappelle, etc. Humor can have an unbelievably powerful effect. And that's not saying you're trying to, we always have this tendency to say, "Oh, well, you're trying to give the person a pass." And it's not that you're trying to give the person a pass. You're trying to be effective and get through to them. If you haven't gotten through to them, you're only focusing on bucket number 1, which is the catharsis, is to get that off your chest, which, again, there's a valid aspect to that. But I would argue if we can educate and help this person, that's probably 50 times more valuable than the cathartic aspect. And with that one, humor can be unbelievably powerful. You may walk away from it saying, "Oh my God, they walked away smiling and educated. That infuriates me because I wanted to hurt them just like they hurt me." But if they walked away smiling but fully educated, that probably is the better outcome. And so that's usually how I go about it. And then I'd say even at the earlier stages of my career, that was how I handled it. But if you have absolutely no power, first year, second year associate, no offense to first year, second year associates listening to this. But if you have less power, obviously it's a little bit more difficult than if you have, the room that you're captured.
Dean Richardson, we have a question from an audience member, Jessica Pollard. What steps do you recommend Black people take to make their company culture more inclusive? How can I convince my CEO to invest in cultural awareness or bias training for a small company? Any tips on starting hard conversations or calling out bias in the workplace without basically jeopardizing my career?
What a wonderful and complicated question. The first thing that I want to respond to in terms of your question is the exhaustion that comes from always being that person within your workplaces who has to take on the burden of change? Because that's what I heard at the beginning of the question that you have. And then secondly, is that worry, because there are studies on this, that if you're a person of color and you are always the one raising these important issues, you can be punished for that, right? We all know that. We've all been in that position and we can be punished for it. And so how do you begin this conversation at your workplace? I guess my first question for you would be, is there support within your workplace from more than just you and from more than simply the people of color who might be there? So that's my first question, because if it's more than just you and it's a group of you, the first thing that I would do is get together as the group of like-minded people, to begin strategizing and having conversations with others within your workplace that might feel the same way and think it's important that these conversations happen. So that's part one. And the other part is with that group that you're conversing with, that is the group, because the bigger and the larger that group is, then going to the CEO, the head of your organization, with a coalition of people. And if it's a multiracial, multi-gendered coalition, even better. And sharing with your CEO, male or female, all of the research that's out there about how, and now this is purely instrumental because we should do this regardless of whether there's increased profit and increased creativity and increased ability to do one's job well, because it's the right thing to do. But sometimes what people need to hear is it can also help to increase the productivity of your organization. So I'm just giving you some things, some steps you might be able to take.
What do you see in terms of the effectiveness of implicit bias training? I can only imagine that it's only as effective if, as JARET said, you work it every day. I can't imagine you go through the training and you're done.
And that is such a great point. Here's what I do, because I do a lot of these talks, and I like to think of them as talks versus trainings. And the reason for that is I have a very specific audience in mind when I give these talks to organizations. I'm speaking to people like the one who just asked the last question. And if leadership is there, I'm also speaking to them, because the idea is not to make people comfortable, not to give people an excuse the way Luther and Leonard Pitts were talking about on the first panel, but rather, and it's also not about changing our own unconscious biases, because that's incredibly difficult, right? Because our brains are learning these unconscious biases just by living. So the key is to give people enough information that they start making changes, structural changes within their organization. So how do they hire people is one question. What type of metrics do they use? What performance evals, and how do they go about doing those performance evals? And are they taking into account the way that unconscious biases can influence us? Are they looking at their policies and procedures in the same way that police departments should, right? Are they looking at how do they incentivize behaviors? And what behaviors do they want to create incentives for? Do they measure the invisible work that people of color do at every organization? I mean, we're seeing this right now. I'm seeing this as a dean right now with all of the protests going on across the country to reckon with race and racism and anti-Blackness. My phone, right? I'm the dean of a law school. And on top of being a dean, while we're dealing with a global pandemic, I am also, because I care about it, addressing issues of anti-Blackness, conscious racism, unconscious bias, and all of that work is not my actual job.
Exactly.
Right? and so that is exactly right. All of us here right now.
I am going to have to wrap up. I think, again, this has been another conversation we could listen to for another 2 hours. I so appreciate both Dean Elsong Richardson and Attorney JARET Davis, based here in Miami, for starting to lay the bricks of the pathway to at least examine our own implicit biases and to see where they are limiting not just ourselves, but other people in our minds and in our estimation. Thank you both very, very much. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Our next guests are CARLTON Ford, a national fundraiser for the arts, who is also examining the subtle, and some would say devious, languaging of racism, and Carlos Martinez. Carlos Martinez is the Miami-Dade public defender. Welcome both. It's great to see you both.
Hi, Nancy. Great to see you.
Hi, great to be here.
For joining us. My first question is for CARLTON. You wrote a widely read op-ed for the Miami Herald on the language of racism and how it can be shorthand or a code that triggers implicit bias. You used inner city as an example, but there are many others. Can you elaborate, please?
Absolutely. Again, thank you for this opportunity to share with our Miami community and the greater community listening here. The response to the piece has really been overwhelming, and something that I've found people have sort of said it was kind of cathartic to list. There was kind of a vocabulary bank that people were submitting. Words like inner city, urban, underserved, underrepresented, but also black on black crime. There were individuals who said even terms like single mother could be used to mean so much more. And what it really gets down to is you can't take these terms for face value because of everything that the individuals have been discussing. When you hold the terms up to your implicit bias, you realize that you are referring to so much more, and it's so loaded. Inner city, for instance, was popularized in the 1960s to talk about the urban migration, and now it's really come to signify poor Black urban neighborhoods. So it's not necessarily a depictor of a geographic location as though you would assume. It is so much more. And, you know, in my experience with even terms like inner city, you know, I started my road to being a national fundraiser actually through the arts. I was an opera singer and went to Interlochen Center for the Arts, where now I'm a fundraiser, and went to Juilliard after and sang all over the world as an opera singer. And I remember singing in an illustrious cast overseas, and I got this question a lot: how did you become an opera singer, an international opera singer, a Black guy, right? And this is a question I was used to answering. And as we discussed it and I shared my background, it wasn't until I said I came from an urban environment and that you could see the nods: inner city, urban environment. That was the context that people were most comfortable talking about artists of color. Is they must have come from an urban city background and clawed their way out of poverty, right? And while that is most certainly the experience of many, and it was my experience, it's such triggering language, and it is static language, right? That was an experience, and yet you find that you are hemmed in by these terms. Another term that has been specific to my Miami experience is the term African American. I mean, the descriptor of African American. Coming from Chicago, a Midwesterner, I moved here about a decade ago to Miami, looking to connect with the African American community. And I quickly understood that African American, what I perceived as African American, I was thinking of Black individual. And I quickly learned that it's so much deeper, it's so much broader here in Miami. So, you know, through understanding the Haitian community, the Jamaican, Trinidadian, even Dominican, and, you know, every aspect of the African diaspora, I came to understand that the best descriptor of the Black community here in Miami is Black. And so, you know, that highlighted, it was holding a mirror up to my own implicit bias of African American and wanting to label everyone of dark skin African American.
Sure. Right, absolutely. You know, it's interesting, you mentioned the word single mother and what that means. I noticed that, especially if it's a feature story, or if the woman is a single mom, she's white. You know, moms, you know, they're really neat, and they you know, they do mom things. If it's a single mother, I notice it's usually or often about a Black woman who's single. Single mom, I think, seems to indicate, well, she's just, you know, she's just a divorced woman, but she was married to the man. She's just a divorced woman. And but single mother has another implication depending on the context. Carlos, given what you heard Carlton just talk about, what is it that you noticed among your own attorneys and your staffers? As I said, you are the Miami-Dade public defender. What is it that you noticed at your office that led you to put them through implicit bias training?
Thank you again for the opportunity. It was probably around 2015 when the American Bar Association and different bar associations throughout the country were really starting to tackle the issue of implicit bias. And with my office, it really struck a chord for me when I read a law review article that was entitled Implicit Racial Bias in Public Defender Triage. And the word triage for public defenders happens when an office is underfunded, when they have too many cases, when they don't have enough attorneys, which was the exact situation that we have been in my office in 2008 through essentially 2011 or so. So it struck a nerve with me. And when I read the article, I started identifying all the different intersection points in which what the public defender is doing actually influences the direction of a case. So, and those unconscious biases influence public defender decision-making. And a lot of it has to do with generations of racial stereotypes about crime, and also with public defenders feeling that they're helpless in being able to challenge the fact that they don't have enough funding.
Give us a specific in terms of what was and wasn't happening that bothered you.
So perfect example. An individual comes in and he's arrested. We get the case, and that individual has 6 pages of prior criminal history, which is extensive in terms of contacts with law enforcement. If you get that case versus another case where the person only has 1 page of criminal history, really unconsciously, what you do as a defense attorney, and what we used to do way back when, was to look at the case and say, I really need to focus on the one without any prior criminal history, because I don't want that person to get into the cycle of having a criminal history and ruining their life. What we started doing is looking at it exactly the opposite, which is just because you have somebody with multiple prior criminal history does not mean that the person is guilty of this instance. And so the issue that we had was trying to make sure that our attorneys were conscious that that influences, when they look at the prior criminal history, it influences what they do. And we wanted to make sure that we disrupted that. And that's why we brought really the training and the conversations.
Thank you. We have an audience member, Neil Goodman. He asks, what evidence do you have that this training has really been effective for your staff and helps reduce that kind of triage bias? Have you seen long-lasting results from the training that they took?
We have, because not only did we have the training, we also retrained our supervisors to make sure that they were establishing what the baseline was, and also making sure that the way they supervise is very different. It's not just from observing how people perform in the courtroom. It's more to looking at what is actually being done in the cases. How quickly is a client being interviewed? How quickly are we filing the motions to get the client released? because we know if we get the client released, the results are going to be better. So we actually look at data, and our supervisors look at data, and that regular conversation and oversight has changed the behavior of people knowing full well the importance of getting to the case early and challenging everything early on.
Do you, like Jared suggested, have to take it, pursue it and keep on top of it, day after day? Or is this well enough ingrained in your culture?
While I can say that it is our culture, you cannot let it go. You have got to, on a regular basis, be checking on a regular basis, be making sure that you're having these discussions and that you're connecting the dots. Because a lot of times an attorney is not going to recognize what an individual case does to an entire community because of so many cases. The other aspect of this that I think is really important for folks to know is we worked with the state attorney's office. Catherine Rundle, she had her training. She did her implicit bias training. She invited my office. Several of us went. And then when we had our training, we had prosecutors, we had police, we had corrections officers, and we had judges. And it has not just been the training. There have been actions that have been put in place in terms of actually making sure that our appellate attorneys are watching court, are watching what the trial judges are doing, are watching what our attorneys are doing to make sure that we are continuously checking on what is it that's going on. Is there racial bias going on? Is there any other kind of bias going on? So this is really has to be a system where you're doing this. And then, of course, let's not forget the police. And that's a big part of it, too.
Okay, thank you. Carlton, a number of our guests now have kind of set up guideposts for us to incorporate either recognition of implicit bias in the workplace and also in our own lives. Can you talk about how we should be going about recognizing the language that we use that may be rooted in implicit bias and is used as a way to squeeze an entire group of people into one small box? Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been said over and over in these conversations on this panel. There's a reference to superiority, inferiority in this language, and you'll find that if you really examine it. It starts with examining yourself, right? Because we all have implicit bias, and you will find that in certain language that you use, there is a reference to a superiority, inferiority. It's a great thing to remember that in the language, there's always a community or an individual that you have in mind when you use that term. We use the term underserved. We use the term inner city. There's an individual or a community of individuals that we have in mind when we use those words. Probably best to be specific as to what who that individual is or who that community is. And we have if we're going to do away with this old vocabulary bank, there is already a vocabulary bank that is there. It's used in the public health sector. It's talking about the racial and ethnic segments of a community, talking about the socioeconomic status, the gender, sexual orientation, age, physical ability, education. To speak specifically to what we mean and to who we are seeking to engage and have a relationship with, as far as the institution to a community, and to be specific. If you mean, instead of inner city, if we mean, a Black community or a Latinx community of a certain socioeconomic status, let's just be specific. And that perhaps will start to lead the way, because this is a daily work, and our language and how we shift our language will help guide us in better understanding others. And in my experience coming to Miami, better understanding myself.
Is there reading material that you can suggest that people take a look at in order to learn more about this? learn how they themselves are speaking?
It's, you know, the works of Dr. Ibram Kendi have really been pushed to the forefront. Anything of his writing is something that is going to be edifying. And to just continue to ask the question, can I be more specific? What do I mean by that? And if you find that you can peel that onion back one more layer and get specific to what you actually mean, as Mr. Martinez said, there's always a tie between, in his case, the individual case in the community, there's always a tie between the individual descriptor we use and how that would uplift or better engage an entire community. So this work of specificity on a singular basis is going to help entire communities and our relationship to entire communities.
You directed your op-ed to nonprofits that do work with low income, underserved, just kind of roll off one's tongue, even though you have criticized it. Do you find that that kind of languaging, those shortcuts, damage the type of help and policies that such organizations give? And
Absolutely. We have a minute. Yeah, I can be brief here. Absolutely. Just as me walking into the opera rehearsal studio and it felt like, oh, here comes the urban inner city artist. You know, you don't, when you invite in a nonprofit, if you're looking to really engage and uplift and empower communities and generations of communities, you know, it's best. People have reached out and asked, well, do we do away with under language, underserved, underrepresented? And we put this out there. What if instead you said, Black students, Latinx students are underserved by our efforts in X, or instead of we want more representation of underrepresented groups on our board, it's we notice that Black executives, Black leaders are underrepresented on our board. It changes it so that the label is not a label on a community, but it's talking about a stage of engagement, right? So it's a tough investment. It's a tough work, but the whole thing about an investment is that there's promise for greater on the other side. And I think this work in specificity will help us get there.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you for participating, for imparting your wisdom. We have been talking to Carlos Martinez. He is the public defender for Miami-Dade County, and Carlton Ford, a national arts fundraiser for Interlochen, and studying language and asking us to mind our words. I also want to thank the audience for watching. I really hope that our goal was met, which was to really have all of us walk away with some guideposts as to help us engage ourselves and engage other people of difference. I don't know if Carlton would like that or not. To live more fully in this community. Thank you all very much for joining in.